The winter of 1941 had shattered Hitler's dream of conquering Moscow in a lightning campaign. German armor, which months earlier had advanced like an unstoppable tide on the Soviet Union, was now mired in snow and mud, surrounded by horse corpses, frozen tanks, and exhausted soldiers. Operation Barbarossa, which was supposed to topple the Soviet colossus within weeks, had failed in the face of fierce resistance from the Red Army and the brutality of the Russian winter. But even defeated at Attrition, the gates of Moscow, the Germans had not completely retreated. They clung tooth and nail to a strategic piece of territory, the Rzhev salient, a bulge on the eastern front that extended deep into Soviet lines, just 200 kilometers from the capital. To the Soviets, this was not just a piece of land, it was a steel blade thrust into the chest of the Soviet Union. Rzhev was no ordinary city. It was a vital crossroads where roads, rivers, and railway lines met. From the salient, the Germans could, at any moment, relaunch an offensive against Moscow. Stalin knew this, and every general on his general staff saw that spot on the map as a mortal threat. It was like a knife held in Hitler's hand, ready to be turned and pierced again into the heart of Russia. The landscape around Rzhev had already been transformed into a scene of total war. Villages burned, fields turned to mud by explosions, forests filled with trenches and fortified positions. There, the Wehrmacht built veritable walls of barbed wire, concrete pillboxes, and deep defensive lines. For the Germans, this salient was a protective shield against the Soviet offensive. For the Soviets, it was an open wound that needed to be cauterized, no matter the cost. And the price would be terrible. Because Stalin, looking at that map in Moscow, didn't just see geography, he saw humiliation. Hitler, even after the failure before his capital, still maintained a position that directly threatened him. This was intolerable, and it was at that moment that the order was given. Rzhev needed to be destroyed. What followed would go down in history not as a glorious victory, but as one of the bloodiest and most forgotten chapters of the war, a place where every inch of land would be watered by rivers of blood. The Russian people would give this place a dark name, the Rzhev meat grinder. If you want to relive history like never before, subscribe now and get into the heart of the battles. The Rzhev salient wasn't just a dot on the map. It was a living nightmare for anyone fighting there. Imagine a clenched fist thrust deep into Soviet lines. That's what the Germans had created. The Wehrmacht, following Hitler's orders, dug in, fortified, and transformed the entire region into an insurmountable fortress. Trenches stretched for miles, winding through forests and devastated fields. Every hillside was crowned with machine gun nests. There were concrete pillboxes and underground bunkers connected by narrow tunnels. The ground was littered with mines, barbed wire, and camouflaged booby traps. From the hilltops, German guns dominated every road and clearing. For the Soviets, advancing against this would have been like running headlong into a wall of iron and fire. But the real terror wasn't just in the defenses, it was in the terrain itself. The Rzhev region was made up of treacherous swamps, winding rivers, and dense forests. In summer, the ground turned to thick mud, swallowing boots and bogging down tanks. In winter, the same. Ground froze hard as stone, and the cold cracked the soldier's skin, turning every breath into pain. Nature itself seemed to conspire against the men who fought there. For the Germans, the salient was a strategic asset. It threatened Moscow, forcing Stalin to keep entire divisions trapped on that front, unable to be deployed to other battles. For Hitler, Rzhev was the anchor of the Eastern Front, a fulcrum that held the entire line of Army Group Center. For the Soviets, however, that salient was a humiliation. How could they accept that, so close to Moscow, the invaders held a stronghold? Every day that Rzhev remained in German hands was a reminder that the enemy could still return to try to take the capital. Stalin did not forgive such threats. And that is how the Rzhev salient came to be known, even among Soviet soldiers, as the Red Army Cemetery. because any attempt to remove it would cost rivers of blood. It was a nightmare that wouldn't be erased upon waking. It was real, and it was about to swallow hundreds of thousands of men. Don't just watch the war. Live every epic moment. Click subscribe. Stalin demands blood. Stalin's patience had limits, and Rzhev exceeded them all. For him, that German salient wasn't just a military threat, it was a personal affront. How could the enemy, after the victory in Moscow, still hold a closed fist just 200 kilometers from the Soviet capital? For Stalin, this was intolerable. In the Kremlin, in its cold, pipe-smoke-filled rooms, the dictator didn't speak of caution, he spoke of revenge. At every meeting with the Stavka, his general staff, Stalin's fist pounded the table. Drive them out of Rzhev, at any cost. And at any cost wasn't a metaphor. Stalin believed that the life of a Soviet soldier was just another resource, like gunpowder or steel. He knew he had millions of men, and he was willing to sacrifice them to eliminate the threat. If it meant throwing entire armies against the salient until they all fell, so be it. Moscow couldn't sleep peacefully while that knife was pointed at the heart of the homeland. The generals, even the most experienced, like Zhukov and Konev, knew the price would be high. They had before them reconnaissance reports that spoke of nearly impenetrable German defenses, deep trenches, and frozen rivers that would be crossed under enemy fire. But who would dare challenge Stalin? Questioning his order meant losing not only one's command, but one's life. And then, in the freezing winter of 1942, the order was formalized. The Red Army would launch a series of offensives against Rzhev. There would be no let-up. If one failed, another would begin. If a division was annihilated, another would replace it. Stalin's dictum was clear. Where the Soviet soldier falls, another will rise. The atmosphere in the Soviet ranks was one of tension and resignation. The men knew they were being thrown against an iron wall, but they also knew there was no choice. The war was total, and retreat was a crime. Many marched with fear in their hearts, others with anger burning in their eyes, but all with the certainty that, dead or alive, they would be used to try to crush the salient. It was the beginning of a bloodbath. Rzhev was about to become not just a battleground, but a human meat grinder, where Stalin's order would echo like a death sentence. Attack. Always attack. History is bleeding onto the screen. Join us and discover every detail. The first coup, January 1942. The cold was bone-chilling. The wind blew like invisible blades, and the snow piled up in thick layers, covering the earth like a white blanket. But that white would soon be tinged with red. The Red Army was preparing for the first assault on the Rzhev salient. Ill-equipped troops, often lacking adequate winter clothing, huddled at the starting lines. Some soldiers wore makeshift felt boots. Others wrapped their feet in rags. There was a shortage of food and ammunition, but there was no shortage of orders. And the orders were clear. Advance against the enemy. The offensive began with artillery barrages. The sky exploded with thunder. The ground shook, and columns of smoke rose from the German positions. To those watching from afar, it seemed as if nothing could survive the bombardment. But the Wehrmacht was prepared. The concrete bunkers held, the deep trenches absorbed the impact, and when the Russians advanced, they were met by a storm of machine gun fire. The Soviet advance was a martyrdom. Men trudged through the thick snow, which slowed every step, while the enemy fired from high ground. MG-34 machine guns, spewing continuous fire, mowed down entire ranks. Those who fell were left behind, their bodies freezing the instant their blood touched the snow. Others stumbled over the corpses of their comrades, creating a macabre path of flesh and ice. The columns of T-34 tanks, the pride of the Red Army, also encountered hell. Many sank into swamps hidden under the snow, or became trapped in craters opened by the bombings. Those that managed to advance were surrounded by German anti-tank guns, which from camouflage positions blasted the tanks one by one. Tank turrets flew through the air like pot lids thrown by an invisible force. And still, the Soviets pressed on. Orders were shouted by officers with pistols drawn. Pistols pointed not at the enemy, but at their own men who hesitated to advance. It was fight or die by the enemy's bullets, or by the bullets of their own commanders. By the end of the first day, the ground around Rzhev was covered with thousands of bodies. The attack had not broken through the German defenses, but Stalin would not hear of failure. For him, every meter gained, every soldier killed, was just part of the inevitable price of victory. The first blow didn't break the salient. On the contrary, it merely revealed Rzhev's true face. It wouldn't be a quick battle, it wouldn't be a well-aimed attack. It would be a prolonged slaughter, a struggle in which men would be ground down like grain in a machine of blood and iron. The meat grinder had started to turn. Every soldier, every battle, every sacrifice. Don't miss a moment. Sign up to the frozen jungle. Rzhev was no ordinary battlefield. There were no wide avenues or open towns for quick maneuvers. What surrounded the salient was a frozen jungle, a maze of dense forests, treacherous swamps, and icy rivers. In summer, the terrain turned to sticky mud, sucking soldiers' feet and swallowing vehicles whole. Trucks were stuck up to their axles, T-34 tanks got stuck like trapped beasts, and men were forced to carry ammunition and supplies on their shoulders, stumbling along trails that resembled open cemeteries. Every step was a test of endurance. In winter, the landscape changed, but not for the better. The cold froze everything. The ground became hard as steel, rivers turned to blocks of ice, and snow-covered trees creaked like broken bones. Soldiers walked for hours with numb feet, unable to feel their own toes. Many fell not from enemy fire, but from the cold, frozen to their feet like grotesque statues in the midst of battle. The forests offered cover, but they also hid horrors. Every tree could hide a German sniper, every clearing could be mined. And when the snow melted, its cruelest face was revealed. Bodies half buried in the ice, men who had fallen weeks before, and only now emerged rigid, with glassy eyes staring blankly into space. The rivers were another obstacle. Frozen, they seemed like safe passages. But when Soviet columns tried to cross them, German artillery opened fire. The ice broke in seconds, swallowing men and horses. Soldiers fell into the icy waters, struggling desperately to emerge, but the current dragged them under. Within minutes, the cold killed them, not by bullets, but by the icy embrace of death. The enemy seemed to multiply. It wasn't just the machine guns, the cannons, or the airstrikes. It was nature itself. Every tree, every river, every patch of mud seemed to want to devour the soldiers. They were fighting against the Germans, but also against the forest, the cold and hunger. It was into this landscape that the Red Army advanced, knowing the terrain had already killed many before the enemy even pulled the trigger. Rzhev wasn't just a military position. It was a gigantic trap, a natural tomb where every step could be the last. And yet the order remained. Move forward, always move forward. If courage and strategy fascinate you, this is the place for you. Sign up now. Relentless counterattacks. Each time the Soviets threw their masses of people against the German trenches, believing they had finally opened a breach, the enemy's response came like a merciless hammer. The Germans weren't content to simply hold their positions. They counterattacked with a precision and brutality that left the Soviets in shock. The tactic was simple and deadly. Let the Soviets bleed in the initial attack. Allow them to advance a few meters and then unleash hell. Panzer tanks emerged from the forests like ambushed predators, supported by artillery batteries that fired incessantly, transforming the battlefield into a sea of smoking craters. What had seemed like a momentary victory soon turned to panic as entire columns of soldiers were crushed under the concentrated fire. The MG-34 and MG-42 machine guns, nicknamed by the Russians as the Mountains, spewed endless volleys. With each Soviet advance, entire divisions were mown down in minutes. The metallic, piercing sound of the bullets resembled that of a sickle harvesting wheat, except that what fell were not ears of wheat, but men. And the Germans had something the Soviets couldn't yet match: coordination between infantry, armor, and the air force. When the Soviet pressure seemed unbearable, the sky roared with the sound of Stukas. Dive sirens screamed like demons, and bombs fell directly on the red columns. The impact threw bodies into the air, tearing men apart amidst the snow and mud. What made the counterattacks even more vicious was Hitler's insistence on holding Rzhev at any cost. This meant that the German generals received constant reinforcements, ammunition, weapons, even entire divisions brought in from other sectors. While the Soviets surged forward with often obsolete weapons and scarce supplies, the Germans responded with calculated, surgical, and devastating strikes. The result was always the same: the Red Army advanced in waves, only to be crushed and driven back to its own lines. The men who survived described the feeling of being inside a crusher, where every step toward the enemy was paid for with dozens of lives. With each counterattack, the battlefield changed little, but the body count increased dramatically. Trenches filled with dead, rivers ran red with blood, entire forests smelled of burning flesh after the bombardments. It was a macabre routine: Soviet attack, German counterattack, and the ground absorbed more blood. Rzhev earned, day after day, its dark fame. No matter who attacked, no matter who defended himself, the only winner was death. Enter the WW2 meat grinder and see what the books don't tell you. Sign up. The Rzhev campaign, an in-depth analysis of Soviet strategy and the human cost. The Rzhev campaign, one of the most brutal and bloody episodes on the Eastern Front during World War II, remains a grim testament to the conflict's ferocity and exorbitant human toll. Central to this narrative is the figure of Georgy Zhukov, one of the most renowned and controversial Soviet commanders whose approach to warfare at Rzhev embodied the Soviet doctrine of mass sacrifice for the sake of victory. Zhukov's strategy, brute force, and relentless persistence. Georgy Zhukov, a name that evoked both respect and fear in the Soviet ranks, was the embodiment of resilience and unwavering determination. His reputation as the hero who saved Moscow and his ability to carry out orders, no matter how costly, earned him the trust of Joseph Stalin. In Rzhev, Zhukov was charged with a monumental task: to annihilate the German salient that threatened the Soviet capital and represented a thorn in the side of the military command. His strategy, far from being an exercise in tactical genius or subtle maneuvering, was a pure manifestation of brute force and relentless persistence. Zhukov's plan for Operation Mars, launched in late 1942, was terrifying in its simplicity. Continuous frontal assaults, wave after wave, until German resistance crumbled under the crushing weight of losses and exhaustion. Human life, in this cold and pragmatic calculation, was a resource to be employed without hesitation. The number of men who would fall was not the primary metric. What mattered was the final breaking of the enemy. To achieve this, an unprecedented concentration of firepower was mobilized. Thousands of artillery pieces were positioned, transforming the landscape into a hell of fire and smoke. Millions of soldiers, many of them newly recruited and with minimal training, were prepared for the advance. The prelude to battle was a Dantesque spectacle. The sky lit up by seemingly endless artillery barrages, the ground trembling under the force of the impacts, creating the illusion of an earthquake. The message to the Soviet troops was clear: nothing would survive on the other side. However, the German defenders at Rzhev were not a force to be reckoned with. Veterans of countless battles on the Eastern Front, they had transformed the salient into an impenetrable fortress. Entrenched in deep defensive positions, protected by multiple layers of fortifications, and with intimate knowledge of the terrain, the Germans were prepared for what would come. As the Soviet attack waves advanced, they were met with a barrage of fire as relentless as the one they had launched. The Soviet infantry lines, despite their bravery and numbers, shattered like glass. Against the steel of the German defenses, Every advance was held back, every attack repulsed with catastrophic losses. A vivid, epic and bloody story. Watch and don't miss a thing. Subscribe now. Zhukov, true to his doctrine, refused to retreat. Each failure was not a reason to re-evaluate strategy, but rather a catalyst for a new, even more intense attack. Entire divisions were decimated, only to be replaced by new formations, which in turn were ground down in the same death traps. It was a vicious cycle of attack, death, replacement and re-attack, a relentless grinding of flesh and spirit. The accounts of the soldiers who survived Rzhev paint a picture of unspeakable despair. Columns of men marched across open ground, easy targets for machine guns and artillery, many falling before even reaching 200 meters from the enemy trenches. T-34 tanks, the vanguard of the Soviet armored force, attempted to cross frozen swamps, only to become bogged down and easy prey for German anti-tank guns. The snow, which should have been a mantle of purity, turned into a macabre carpet, dyed red by the blood of the fallen, where soldiers were forced to run over the bodies of their newly dead comrades. Zhukov maintained an unshakable belief that the enemy would eventually wear himself down, and indeed the Germans were also bleeding, suffering significant losses. However, the ratio was brutally unfavorable to the Soviets. For every German soldier who fell at Rzhev, dozens of Soviets perished. Operation Mars and the Rzhev campaign as a whole became known among Soviet soldiers as the meat grinder. This wasn't an official code name, but a visceral and painfully accurate description of the reality they faced. It was like being thrown into sharp iron gears from which few emerged intact. Despite the staggering human cost, Stalin and Zhukov held the line. Keep going, advance, strike again. Their logic was relentless, devoid of sentimentality. Human life was the fuel, and Rzhev was the furnace that consumed all. The invisible death, the silent terror of Rzhev. Rzhev was not just a stage for the deafening roar of artillery and the crackling of machine guns. It was a silent, invisible graveyard where death lurked in every inch of the earth, manifesting itself in stealthy and unexpected ways. The brutality of the campaign was amplified by the insidious nature of its dangers, which went far beyond direct confrontation with the enemy. Landmines were a constant and terrifying presence scattered throughout the salient. Some were hidden under a thin layer of snow, others strategically placed on seemingly safe trails and paths. One false step could mean a violent explosion, sending shrapnel and body fragments flying. Columns of soldiers advancing cautiously were decimated before they even had a chance to fire a single shot. The ground, which at first glance seemed harmless, was in fact a lethal trap with every meter traveled, turning progression into a Russian roulette, where luck was the only determining factor between life and death. From Rzhev to Stalingrad, from courage to destruction. Follow it all on our channel. The artillery craters, deep scars left by incessant bombardment, also held deadly secrets. At the bottom of these depressions, wounded or fallen soldiers were often buried alive by falling snow or frozen mud, making rescue a nearly impossible task. Those attempting to aid their wounded comrades became easy targets for German snipers who watched patiently from their entrenched positions. The simple act of traversing Rzhev's rugged terrain was a test of courage and a constant challenge to survival. Furthermore, the constant fire of German artillery and heavy artillery was an omnipresent, impersonal and indiscriminate threat. Each barrage transformed the battlefield into a sea of destruction, raising a pall of smoke and dust where bodies and shrapnel mingled in a landscape of horror. Death came without warning, invisible and inevitable, reminding the soldiers that the battle was not just against the human enemy, but against the hostile environment that surrounded them. The terrain of Rzhev was as relentless an adversary as the German troops. Even the snow, which in other circumstances might have brought a sense of peace, in Rzhev only served to accentuate the tragedy. Falling slowly over the dead, it offered no relief, but rather hid the carnage, preserving the vision of terror for those forced to advance. Life and death intertwined in a cruel and paradoxical way. To advance meant facing certain death, but to stop meant disobeying the relentless orders of Stalin and Zhukov, which could also lead to fatal consequences. The choice was between a quick death on the battlefield or execution for desertion. With each passing day, the Rzhev camp grew more macabre. The smell of death permeated the frozen forests. The snow was permanently dyed red, and the silence between attacks was merely the heavy breathing of a living cemetery. For the men fighting there, the enemy was not just the soldier on the other side of the trench, but the earth itself, consuming thousands of invisible lives every day. It was the cruelest face of the meat grinder, a death that came without warning, crushing body and spirit, and reminding everyone that, in that hellish place, survival was a rare miracle, an exception to the brutal rule of annihilation. The Rzhev campaign, with its combination of attrition and unseen dangers, has etched itself into the collective memory as one of the darkest chapters in military history, a perpetual reminder of the unimaginable cost of total war. Every battle has a price. Discover the secrets of war. Sign up. The strategic context and the relentless logic of the war of attrition. Zhukov's decision to employ a strategy of attrition in Rzhev was no mere whim, but a brutal reflection of contemporary Soviet military doctrine and the realities of the Eastern Front. After the devastating losses of the early war and the pressing need to ease pressure on Moscow, the top priority was to wear down the enemy, regardless of the cost. The Rzhev salient, although geographically close to the capital, was an open wound, a constant threat that needed to be neutralized. The logic behind Operation Mars and the subsequent offensives in Rzhev was to tie down and bleed German reserves, preventing them from being transferred to other fronts, such as Stalingrad, where another monumental battle was underway. Human life in this strategic chess game was the bargaining chip. The Soviet Union possessed a vast reserve of manpower, and the Supreme Command was willing to pay an unimaginable price in life to achieve its strategic objectives. This approach, while militarily effective in terms of pinning down enemy forces, had a devastating impact on soldier morale and perception. Operation Mars, in particular, was conceived as a large-scale offensive with multiple axes of attack, aimed at encircling and destroying the German Ninth Army. However, a lack of coordination between the fronts, the inexperience of many of the new divisions, and the German defensive tactical superiority turned this ambition into a catastrophe. Soviet field commanders, under relentless pressure from Zhukov and Stalin, were often forced to launch ill-prepared attacks without adequate artillery or armor support, resulting in predictable massacres. The Rzhev landscape, with its frozen marshes, dense forests, and fortified villages, favored the defense, turning every Soviet advance into a desperate fight for every inch of ground. The psychological impact, the invisible price of battle. Beyond the physical losses and material destruction, the Rzhev campaign left deep, invisible scars on the soldiers' psyches. The constant artillery bombardment, the incessant sound of machine guns, the sight of comrades falling by the thousands, and the constant proximity of death created an atmosphere of terror and despair. The life expectancy of an infantryman in Rzhev was frighteningly short, and with each new attack, the likelihood of survival decreased drastically. Many developed what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, manifested by nightmares, insomnia, apathy, and a profound disillusionment with war and life. The nickname meat grinder was not only a description of the tactics, but also a metaphor for the dehumanization occurring on the battlefield. Soldiers felt like cogs in a gigantic machine, disposable and replaceable. Individuality was suppressed in favor of the mass, and the life of a single man had little value in the face of the greater goal of victory. This perception, while understandable in the context of total war, corroded the soul and left a legacy of bitterness and trauma that would linger for decades. The need to march over the bodies of one's own comrades, the blood-stained snow, and the constant presence of invisible death from mines and snipers all contributed to an almost unbearable psychological burden. Are you ready to face the front lines of history? Click subscribe. The legacy of Rzhev, a bitter and forgotten victory. Despite its colossal cost in lives, the Rzhev campaign is often overshadowed by more famous battles such as Stalingrad and Kursk. However, its strategic role was crucial. By pinning down and exhausting a significant number of German divisions, Rzhev indirectly contributed to the Soviet success at Stalingrad, preventing German reinforcements from reaching the besieged city. The campaign demonstrated the Soviet ability to absorb massive losses and continue fighting, a trait that would become a decisive factor in the ultimate victory over Nazi Germany. However, Rzhev's legacy is complex and controversial. For many, it represents the epitome of the brutality of Soviet warfare, where human life was sacrificed on an industrial scale. For others, it is a testament to the resilience and sacrifice of the Soviet people in defense of their homeland. The memory of those who fell at Rzhev, many of them without a known grave, serves as a somber reminder of the price of war and the importance of remembering even the most bitter victories. The landscape around Rzhev still bears the traces of this carnage, with fragments of metal and bones emerging from the ground, a silent and perpetual testament to the meat grinder that operated there, consuming generations and shaping history with blood and sacrifice. The challenges of the terrain and the nature of winter warfare. The Rzhev salient was not just a fortified position. It was a natural labyrinth of swamps, dense forests, and frozen rivers that became death traps. The region's geography, combined with the extreme weather conditions of the Russian winter, exponentially amplified the brutality of the fighting. Deep snow and ice turned the movement of troops and equipment into a logistical nightmare. Vehicles became bogged down. Infantry became rapidly exhausted, and visibility was frequently reduced by blizzards and fog. The freezing temperatures, often dropping to below 0 degrees Celsius, caused frostbite and hypothermia, adding another layer of suffering and casualties not directly related to combat. Weapons and equipment froze, requiring constant maintenance and hampering operations. The frozen marshes, which were supposed to offer a route of advance for Soviet tanks, often proved treacherous. The thin ice gave way under the weight of the T-34s, which sank into the mud and icy water, becoming immobile targets for German anti-tank artillery. The dense forests, meanwhile, were ideal for ambushes and camouflage defense, allowing German defenders to inflict heavy casualties with machine guns and snipers while remaining relatively protected. Every tree, every rise in the terrain, every frozen stream became a point of bloody contestation, where advantage was often determined by the ability to withstand cold and hunger as much as tactical skill, the human cost in numbers and indifference to loss. Although the text avoids specific references, it is crucial to understand the magnitude of the human cost at Rzhev. Soviet losses were astronomical, far exceeding German casualties. It is estimated that hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured in the various offensives against the Rzhev salient. The casualty ratio at times reached 10 or more Soviet soldiers for every German. This shocking disparity reflects Zhukov's strategy of attrition and the Soviet command's willingness to sacrifice vast numbers of men to achieve strategic objectives, however limited. For Soviet leaders, individual lives were secondary to the survival of the state and ultimate victory. This indifference to the loss of human life, though brutal, was seen as a pragmatic necessity in a conflict of annihilation. The Soviet Union, with its vast population, could replace its losses on a scale that Germany could not. However, for the soldiers on the front, this reality translated into constant terror and the feeling of being mere numbers in a military equation. The lack of proper burials for many of the dead, who lay under the snow or in makeshift mass graves, only accentuated the dehumanization of war. The memory of these sacrifices, often unrecognized or minimized in official historiography for decades, is a poignant reminder of the true price of victory. Strategic implications and the role of Rzhev in the Great Patriotic War. Rzhev's strategic role, despite its reputation as an ineffective meat grinder, was more complex than a simple casualty count. The Soviet offensives at Rzhev, though costly, accomplished the crucial objective of pinning down the German Ninth Army, one of the Wehrmacht's most powerful formations. This pinning prevented these divisions from being transferred south, where the Battle of Stalingrad was at its height. Without reinforcements from the Ninth Army, the German situation at Stalingrad became untenable, culminating in the encirclement and destruction of the German Sixth Army. Thus, Rzhev, indirectly, played a vital role in turning the tide on the Eastern Front. Furthermore, the Rzhev operations served as a brutal training ground for the Red Army. Although frontal assault tactics were costly, the experience gained in large-scale combat, the coordination of artillery and infantry, even if imperfect at first, and the ability to sustain prolonged offensives under adverse conditions were valuable lessons that would be applied with greater success in later campaigns. The campaign also tested and honed Soviet leadership, forcing commanders like Zhukov to adapt and refine their approaches, even at terrible cost. Rzhev, therefore, was not only a tragedy, but also a crucible where the ultimate Soviet victory was forged, paving the way for the eventual defeat of Nazi Germany. Life in hell in Rzhev, an existence of triple suffering. Living in Rzhev was not merely a matter of fighting a visible enemy. It was a daily, relentless struggle against a three-dimensional hell, where biting cold, excruciating hunger, and the constant presence of death intertwined to create a reality of unspeakable suffering. The Soviet trenches, far from being merely strategic defensive lines, became tunnels of misery, where men, stripped of almost all their humanity, lived with paralyzing fear, debilitating disease, and the pungent smell of death that seeped into every fiber of their existence. The relentless winter, the frozen adversary. The Russian winter in Rzhev was as lethal an adversary as German bullets, if not more so. Temperatures routinely plummeted to 30 degrees Celsius and often even lower, turning the air into a razor that cut through exposed skin. Snow accumulated in thick, relentless layers, not only hampering, but often completely blocking the movement of troops and supplies. Soldiers, exhausted and lacking adequate shelter, were forced to sleep outside, in makeshift holes in the snow or in rudimentary dens dug into the frozen earth. Their clothing, often torn and inadequate, offered little protection against the piercing cold, and their boots, often shoddy or worn, barely protected their feet from frostbite. With each breath, the hot steam from their mouths instantly condensed into ice crystals, a constant reminder of the deadly temperature surrounding them. Many simply never woke after a night of forced sleep, their bodies transformed into ice statues, silent victims of the cold that stole life without a single shot. Hypothermia was a constant threat, and each day more men succumbed to it, their hearts slowly stopping under the weight of the ice. The excruciating hunger, the enemy within food, was a distant mirage, a reminder of a more civilized past. Rations were minimal, often consisting of a small piece of stale bread and watery soup, barely containing enough nutrients to sustain life. These meager portions were divided among starving men whose bodies wasted away daily. Malnutrition was widespread, weakening resistance to disease and making soldiers more vulnerable to injury. The search for food became an obsession. Those who ventured to search for supplies in abandoned villages, hoping to find something edible, ran the imminent risk of being shot down by German snipers patrolling the unoccupied areas, or of stepping on landmines hidden under the snow. Hunger not only corroded bodies, but also hope, transforming men into shadows of their former selves, their eyes empty and their minds focused only on the next meal, which might never come. The energy to fight was drained by the constant battle against an empty stomach, and morale dropped to dangerous levels. The omnipresent death, a constant companion. In Rzhev, death was not a sporadic event, but a constant companion, a palpable presence that loomed over every trench, every hole, every step. It wasn't just the visible horrors of artillery, machine guns, and tanks that claimed lives. Disease, fueled by malnutrition, cold, and poor hygiene, swept through the trenches like a plague. Typhus, dysentery, and pneumonia were as lethal as enemy bullets. Extreme fatigue and physical and mental exhaustion pushed men to the limit of their endurance, making them sluggish, apathetic, and incapable of fighting back. The wounded were often left in the trenches for days, waiting for help that often never arrived. Blood froze in open wounds, turning the pain into icy torment. Each morning, the landscape grew redder, not only because of the sunrise, but also because of the scattered bodies, mixed with the snow and mud, a silent testament to the previous night's carnage. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder, blood, and decaying flesh, a nauseating fragrance that had become an integral part of the Rzhev experience. The nights of terror and the fight for humanity. The nights in Rzhev were a chapter in the Book of Hell. The silence, which should have brought relief, was actually more terrifying than the noise of battle. It was a heavy silence, allowing the darkest thoughts and deepest fears to surface. This silence was broken only by the ghostly creak of snow-covered trees, the howl of the icy wind, or the distant menacing sound of nighttime bombardments. The soldiers sensed death near, a shadow lurking in the depths of the darkness. Many, in a desperate act of connection with the world they had left behind, wrote letters home, knowing they might never be sent, that those words would be their last. Some sought solace in faith, silently praying for a miracle. Others, in a last shred of humanity, muttered curses, forgotten songs, or memories of their past lives, trying to cling to any shred of normalcy amidst the chaos. Sanity was a thin line, constantly threatened by brutal reality, camaraderie, and the relentless logic of survival. Even in the face of such desperation, the orders continued to come, relentless and unquestionable. Advance, resist, survive. Each man knew that hesitation meant not only death, but immediate replacement, a cruel reminder of their expendability. Camaraderie, that deep and unbreakable bond between men who shared the same suffering, was the only protection against utter madness. It was a bond forged in the fires of battle, in the sharing of meager rations, in mutual support in moments of terror. Yet even this camaraderie was fragile, constantly tested and sometimes broken by the crushing pressure of the apocalyptic scenario that Rzhev offered. The struggle for individual and collective survival was a macabre dance between hope and despair. Rzhev was not just a battle, it was a laboratory of human suffering, a microcosm of the brutality of total war. Every minute I lived there was laced with the metallic taste of blood, the nauseating smell of death, and the icy weight of cold that penetrated the soul. To live in Rzhev was to fight against nature itself, against the hunger that gnawed at one's core, and against a relentless enemy that attacked from every direction. Surviving this hell was a victory as rare as it was precious, a testament to the indomitable, yet often broken, human will to persist in the face of total annihilation. The memory of Rzhev remains a grim echo, an eternal reminder of the unimaginable cost of war and the resilience of those who endured it. The sky on fire, the air war over. Rzhev and its impact on the ground above the Rzhev salient. The sky was no refuge, but an extension of the hell unfolding on the ground. It was a theater of terror and destruction, where every cloud of smoke, every trace of aircraft condensation could portend imminent death. The war in Rzhev was fought in multiple dimensions, and the airborne one was as brutal and relentless as the ground one. with devastating consequences for the soldiers below. Luftwaffe supremacy and the Stuka terror. The Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, with its vast experience and doctrine of close air support, dominated the skies over Rzhev. Its pilots, many of them veterans of previous campaigns, were masters of ground attack tactics, transforming fields and forests into nightmare scenarios with their deadly precision. The constant presence of German aircraft was a stark reminder of the vulnerability of Soviet soldiers who lived under the perpetual threat of attack from above. The Junkers Ju-87 Stuka, with their unmistakable and terrifying design, were the harbingers of destruction. Diving at high speed, their attack sirens, known as Jericho trumpets, emitted a shrill, demonic scream that pierced the air, announcing the imminent arrival of bombs. This sound alone was enough to sow panic and despair among the troops on the ground. High explosive bombs, dropped with surgical precision, crushed tanks, demolished pillboxes, and threw soldiers into the air with the force of their explosions. The impact on the ground was so violent that the previously immaculate snow mixed with blood and earth, creating a surreal landscape of red and white, a macabre mosaic of carnage. Each explosion was a brutal and undeniable reminder that in Rzhev, no one, anywhere, was truly safe from the fury falling from the sky. The Soviet response and the struggle for a contested sky. Although the Luftwaffe maintained a considerable advantage, the Soviets were not completely defenseless. The Red Air Force, despite its initial shortcomings and often poor coordination, tried hard to fight for control of the airspace. Fighters like the Yaks and Leg-GGs and bombers like the Pe-2 and Il-2 Sturmovik were launched on dangerous missions, targeting German lines and attempting to relieve pressure on ground troops. However, a lack of adequate training, a shortage of spare parts, and the tactical superiority of German pilots often resulted in heavy losses for the Soviets. Their attacks often failed to hit their targets or were intercepted before even reaching enemy lines, turning the missions into costly sacrifices. Yet each Soviet plane that managed to penetrate German air defenses and deliver its bomb load or strafe enemy positions carried with it not only explosives, but also hope. It was the hope of turning the tide, of offering a moment of relief to comrades on the ground, of showing that the sky was not the enemy's exclusive domain. These acts of bravery, though often fleeting, were crucial to the morale of the ground troops, who saw in the presence of their own planes a sign that they were not completely abandoned to their fate. Devastating effects on the ground. The amplification of suffering. The aerial battle had direct and devastating effects on the ground, amplifying the soldiers' suffering and transforming each advance into an act of almost superhuman courage. As the bombs fell, enormous craters opened in the frozen earth, swallowing men, horses, and equipment, obliterating entire trenches in the blink of an eye. The survivors, dazed and covered in dust and debris, scrambled desperately for cover, seeking any kind of cover amidst the chaos. Those unable to move, wounded or trapped, were engulfed in fire and smoke, their lives taken in an instant. Accounts from the time describe apocalyptic scenes, trees ripped from the ground with their roots exposed, houses and villages in flames, and the ground trembling incessantly with each new explosion, as if the earth itself were in agony. The air was saturated with the smell of gunpowder, smoke and burning flesh, a nauseating mixture that became Rzhev's olfactory signature. The burning sky over Rzhev wasn't just a fight for air superiority, it was an intrinsic extension of the war on the ground, an element that exponentially amplified the soldiers' terror and suffering. Men ran between explosions, frozen with fear and cold, their eyes fixed on the sky, knowing that at any moment a bomb could fall on them, turning them into another statistic in the vast casualty count. The uncertainty and helplessness in the face of airstrikes added an extra layer of psychological torment, making life in Rzhev even more unbearable. And despite all the horror, the war machine continued its relentless grinding. Both German and Soviet planes continued to climb, dive, fire, and explode day after day, night after night. The sky seemed like an open furnace, illuminating the carnage below, a constant testament to the fact that Rzhev was indeed a complete meat grinder, on the ground, in the trenches, in the frozen swamps, and now in the skies as well. It was a battle that consumed everything, not only bodies and equipment, but also the hope and sanity of those who experienced it, leaving an indelible mark on the hearts of those who miraculously managed to survive. Between 1942 and 1943, Rzhev became more than just a battlefield. It became a real human meat grinder. Soviet attacks were launched repeatedly, day after day, with troops advancing in endless waves against fortified German defenses, only to be massacred before achieving any significant objective. With each offensive, the death toll rose almost incomprehensibly. Soldiers fell in the snow, freezing with open wounds, while those advancing over the bodies of their comrades were met with bursts of machine gun fire and heavy artillery. Entire trenches were engulfed in explosions, and frozen rivers became death traps as they burst under the weight of tanks and men. Hitler permitted no retreat. Every meter of land conquered by the Soviets was immediately contested by calculated counterattacks. The losses were not just numbers, they were human stories of extreme suffering. Families never knew the fate of their sons, brothers, and parents, while the survivors bore deep physical and psychological scars. Cold, hunger, and fear combined with enemy fire to create an endless cycle of carnage. Soviet soldiers described the sensation of being ground down by invisible gears. Each advance bringing only more blood and destruction. And yet the orders continued. Advance, attack, do not retreat. The Rzhev salient gained a sinister reputation among all who fought there. Calling it the meat grinder was no metaphor. It was the starkest reality. Men were thrown like grain into a machine that turned courage into death, hope into despair. Each battle increased the toll of the terrain. Over 1 million Soviet lives and hundreds of thousands of German lives would be consumed. The meat grinder spared no one. Veterans, recruits, officers, all were sucked into the same cycle. Rzhev wasn't just a battle, it was a death laboratory, a cruel test of human endurance and the brutality of war. And yet, the offensives continued, driven by Stalin's cold logic and Zhukov's ruthless determination. Hitler refuses to retreat. Even in the face of the inferno unfolding in Rzhev, Hitler remained adamant. For him, abandoning the salient would mean admitting weakness, opening the door to a renewed threat to Moscow, and above all, losing prestige. The numbers didn't matter, the general's warning cries didn't matter. Rzhev should be held at any cost. This obstinacy transformed the salient into a true extended cemetery. Each order to hold positions cost thousands of lives, as German soldiers were repeatedly sent to hold trenches already devastated by Soviet fire. Those who survived the snow, mines, and artillery faced the constant fear that any moment could be their last. The villages around Rzhev were burned, and the open fields became death traps. The enemy refused to retreat, and soldiers who dared question orders were punished with arrests or summary executions. Hitler's rigid discipline and obsession created a climate of terror that hung over everyone, Germans and Soviets alike. The result was an endless prolongation of the carnage. With each attempted Soviet advance, the German troops, though exhausted, responded with calculated and deadly fire. But as they defended themselves, the death toll continued to rise on both sides. The soil of Rzhev absorbed every drop of blood, becoming a silent record of the madness of a war no one could control. Hitler's single-mindedness didn't just kill soldiers, it prolonged the psychological and physical suffering, turning each day into an unbearable challenge. The meat grinder spun harder, grinding away men, hope, and strategy as the war dragged on, slow and bloody. Rzhev was no longer just a strategic point. It was the portrait of a dictator's obsession and the toll that human stubbornness can take on soldiers on the battlefield. While the Soviets continued to bleed in Rzhev, another drama was unfolding hundreds of miles away, the Battle of Stalingrad. The Red Army's fierce resistance in the city on the Volga began to turn the tide on the Eastern Front. What was happening in Stalingrad sent strategic shockwaves all the way to Rzhev. Hitler, alarmed by the siege forming around the Volga city, was forced to divert. Troops from the salient entire divisions, holding positions in Rzhev, were withdrawn to reinforce Stalingrad. For the Soviets, this was the first breach in the German wall, an opportunity that had cost countless lives to create. Despite this, the salient remained deadly. The German lines did not fall immediately. Every Soviet advance continued to be punished by artillery and machine gun fire, and the frozen ground still served as a silent ally to the enemy. But for the first time, there was hope. That stubborn German defense could finally give way. The morale of the Soviet troops began to slowly rise. Though tired and terrified, the soldiers sensed that the tide of war might finally turn. Death still stalked every trench, every forest, every frozen river. But now there was a glimmer of hope. The Germans were beginning to yield ground in other crucial sectors, and this meant that Rzhev was no longer isolated. Even with all the losses mounting, Zhukov's strategic patience and Stalin's determination began to pay off. Soviet persistence was about to be rewarded, not by individual heroism, but by relentless attrition of the enemy. Rzhev was still a meat grinder, but the gears were beginning to show signs of weakness. Victory was still a long way off, but twist of fate had begun, reminding everyone that even in the bloodiest battles, war is driven by unpredictable flows of force and opportunity. After months of incessant massacres, and with the pressure on other fronts becoming unsustainable, the Germans were finally ordered to withdraw from Rzhev. But the retreat was not a clean victory. It was a strategic retreat marked by chaos, destruction, and horror. German soldiers demolished everything they could carry, and much of what they couldn't. Houses were burned, entire villages reduced to ashes, warehouses blown up, bridges destroyed. Every abandoned meter was a minefield and a trap set to delay the Soviet advance. It was the silent retaliation of those who knew they had lost ground, but not their pride. The Soviet troops, advancing in waves, found a devastated land. Open roads were pitted with craters, forests were uprooted, rivers were choked with debris, and corpses were strewn everywhere. The smell of death, the congealed blood, and the remains of tanks and horses created a nightmare scenario. It was bloody mark of the meat grinder that Rzhev had become. Even during the retreat, the Germans launched localized counterattacks to cover their escape. Every ambush, machine gun fire, or mine explosion cost Soviet lives. It was not just a battle, but a lesson that even retreat could be deadly. For the Soviets, advancing was like walking through a graveyard. But there was finally a sense of achievement. The enemy had retreated. The salient, that menacing blade near Moscow, had been dismantled. Even though the victory had come at an incalculable human cost, the direct threat to Moscow had diminished. Rzhev now was a ghost territory, the land, scarred by the blood of hundreds of thousands, would forever remember the brutality of a war that spared no one. Surviving there was a feat. Conquering the enemy meant merely walking on one's own horror. The legacy of Rzhev. When the last German soldier walked away from the salient, what remained was a scene of destruction and bloody memory. Rzhev was not just reclaimed territory. It was a testament to the immeasurable brutality of war on the Eastern Front. Ruined houses, devastated forests, rivers red with frozen blood, all remained as a silent reminder of months of extreme human suffering. The toll was terrifying. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers and tens of thousands of Germans had died there. Families would never know the fate of their sons, brothers, or parents. Survivors bore scars that went far beyond their skin, mental and emotional scars from a conflict that seemed to consume everything around them. But Rzhev also taught strategic lessons. It demonstrated the price of inflexible orders, the devastating effect of treacherous terrain, and human resilience in the face of impossible odds. For Stalin and Zhukov, despite the cost, the salient had been neutralized and the direct threat to Moscow eliminated. But the price had been unimaginable, a constant reminder that the war on the Eastern Front was a literal and relentless meat grinder. Rzhev's legacy also extends to cultural and historical memory. Among the Soviets, the salient became a symbol of extreme sacrifice and heroic perseverance in the face of the enemy. Among historians, it is remembered as one of the bloodiest and most underrated battles of World War II, a battle in which the natural landscape, cold, hunger, and human obstinacy itself shaped an unforgettable chapter of the conflict. Today, even decades later, Rzhev is synonymous with resistance and suffering. Every felled tree, every trench, every blood-stained patch of earth tells the story of men who fought to the limit of human strength. It's a reminder that in war, victory comes at a price that can never be forgotten, and that sometimes surviving is, in itself, an epic act of courage. Even decades after the end of World War II, Rzhev remains a living ghost of human brutality. It's not just a geographic location or a strategic point that changed the course of the war. It's a place where history, suffering, and courage are indelibly intertwined. Every felled tree, every dug trench, and every artillery crater carries with it the invisible weight of hundreds of thousands of lives cut short there. For historians and visitors who walk the grounds today, the experience is almost palpable. Fragments of ammunition and artillery still poke up from the ground, reminding us that the war was not just a distant narrative, but a conflict that left permanent marks on the land and in our memories. The bones of soldiers, buried or forgotten under the snow and mud, emerge in some areas, providing a silent and somber reminder that war consumes everything: lives, homes, forests, and even time. The stories of Rzhev's survivors resonate powerfully. Men who walked among frozen bodies, braved blizzards, starvation, and enemy fire bore not only physical scars, but also deep psychological wounds. Each account, each letter written home, each preserved memory reinforces the image of Rzhev as a literal meat grinder where courage and desperation coexisted side by side. Rzhev thus became a symbol of extreme resilience and human sacrifice. Not just a battle forgotten in books, but a lesson that war has multiple faces: heroism, horror, loss, and remembrance. The region reminds us that victory in war is never free. It always carries the price of blood spilled, accumulated suffering, and lives prematurely snuffed out. Today, the memorials and records dedicated to Rzhev not only commemorate the bravery of those who fought, but also serve as a silent warning to future generations. War is merciless, and the price of human obstinacy can be measured in thousands of lives lost and countless stories cut short. Rzhev is, therefore, more than military history. It is a monument to the bloody memory, indomitable courage, and absolute terror that defined the Eastern Front of World War II.